You're welcome.
Okay. Greetings to those of you who are already online. I'm Kate, the Communications and Outreach Coordinator for the Natural Areas Association. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a second. This is, of course, best management practices for pollinators, creating practices that are meaningful and implementable for rangelands, and calculated floral resource withdrawal by managed honeybees in light of native bee reproduction. While we're waiting, though, and so you guys can learn how to use the chat box if you don't know, because the chat box will be the way that that you ask questions of the speakers. I've put a question up in the chat box. Usually I ask where people are from, but lately I've been asking what people are interested in learning, just very generally, from this conference. And I'd love for you guys to check it out and let me know. Just a very general statement. What is it that you were hoping to gain today? That helps both the speakers and us sort of understand, hey, who's showing up here and what are they hoping to learn? And also let me know if anyone's having trouble seeing something or hearing something. It's possible that we can help. Anyway, and let me know if you have any trouble accessing chat or anything like that. Okay. Okay. We are right at noon. Okay. I'm going to get officially started then. Let me know if anybody has trouble accessing any part of this. I'm not seeing anybody answering the chat question, which is a little concerning. Oh, okay. Oh, here we go. Susan, Carlos, yay. If you raise your hand, that's not the way we're doing this, although thank you. Oh, here we go. Brianna, the chat question is up at the top, and it's basically asking very generally, what are you here to learn today? This isn't an existential question. It's just a very general, what were you hoping to learn? Some people are saying they don't see the chat or the responses. You might want to look and make sure that your chat is on all panelists and attendees. That might help for some people. Oh, now they're coming. I think we just have a delay. All right, let's get started. All right, welcome again. Best management practices for pollinators, creating practices that are meaningful and implementable for rangelands with Scott Hoffman Black of the Xerces Society. Scott is now a two-timer here on the NAA webinar series, and we are really, really thrilled to have him with us again. The second presentation today will be Calculated Floral Resource Withdrawal by Managed Honeybees in Light of Native Bee Reproduction by Jim Kane of the USDA-ARS, Pollinating Insect Research Unit. Something a little out of the ordinary here. Jim very recently found out he was going to be able to attend and speak at the 11th International Symposium on Pollination in Berlin. That happened kind of fast. It's running from the 16th to the 20th this month. And so Jim's presentation is recorded, and I'm going to cue that up after Scott. We apologize, Jim apologizes, but really he had no one else to do what he does, which speaks to the importance of his work, really. And being able to present at such a prestigious event, obviously not to be missed. So we thank Jim for recording his presentation for us, and we're going to ask you to submit questions for Jim during his presentation. I'm going to save them, and he has promised to answer them as soon as he can get to them when he returns from Berlin. All right. And here we go. All right. Just a few words about our pollinator management series, of which this is the last webinar. It's been really an amazing ride. Honestly, the response to this webinar series has been kind of overwhelming, so in a good way. So we welcome you back to the very last and final one this year. We wanted to say that we've had the support of several organizations in putting this series together, notably the Pollinator Partnership and our main supporter, the U.S. Forest Service. This series is, I think, a really good example of what NAA tries to do. What our mission is to support natural areas practitioners. We get you the info you need when and where you need it. This series is going to serve as a companion initiative to the NAA synthesis paper on pollinator health and resilience in natural areas management, which is going to come out a little bit later this year. Our first webinar for our regular webinar series, the non-pollinator, is coming up on May 16th, and we are really excited to welcome David Kriska and some friends from the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. This is going to serve as an introduction to an upcoming regional workshop that the Natural Areas Association is doing this year on July 10th and 11th, which is going to be focused on natural areas restoration with an emphasis on invasive species management. That's going to be in Northeast Ohio and Northwest Pennsylvania. We're super excited about it. We just got some more details about it today. And so we're going to be sending out information about both. We'll remind you of this webinar. We'll also remind you of the regional workshop upcoming. We just want to put in a word about us. Most of you have been to many of these, so you probably have already heard some of my spiel, but here we go. For those of you who don't know us, the Natural Areas Association has been working to support the community of natural areas professionals for more than 40 years. We've really been around for a while. We're coming up on our 45th annual conference. We're very proud of that. More on that shortly. We're the only national nonprofit membership organization dedicated to the support and advancement of the community of natural areas professionals. That's our mission. That's what we do. That is all we do. We are here for people like you. Many of you already know us through the journal. There's a nice picture of the journal there. In fact, that is the special issue for Pollinators issue of the journal, which is for sale. If you would like to go to the journal section of our website at naturalareas.org, those have been selling quite well recently. I think there's a lot of interest clearly in this topic, and the information there continues to be very relevant. Anyway, people know us from the journal. That's our peer-reviewed publication for scientists and natural areas professionals. A subscription to the journal comes with your membership if you join. We also hold the Natural Areas Conference annually. This year it's in Bloomington, Indiana on October 23 through 25. The call for proposals is now open. More on that in a second. We recently debuted a brand new website and member portal which gives our members access to a lot of new resources and tools, including topical listservs. We do have one on pollinators. It's just getting started. We would love to have people weigh in on that. Members now have online access to all issues of the journal back to 1981 with a simple click from our member portal. And we're very proud to offer those perks to our members. We invite you to become a member if you are not already. It's easy. Individual memberships start at $75 a year. And if you think about it, that's the equivalent of about one Starbucks and/or fancy coffee per month. We're very reasonable. You get the journal discounted, access to the conference, and a lot of the other benefits that I've mentioned. A little more about us, which you can access on the website. I did want to put in a word about the 2018 Natural Areas Conference. Our call for proposals closes May 18th, 1 month from today. We are very excited about this. We've got a lot of amazing topics. Some of them are land management in light of climate change, native plant materials and natural areas management, pollinators in natural areas management, migration corridors, private land conservation, invasive species, data and technology, communicating the importance of our work. This is just some of the areas that we're soliciting proposals for in lots of different areas. So take a look on our conference tab on our website. Arthur Scott Russell Sanders is our opening speaker. Oh, I wish I could tell you about our closing plenary speakers. They're 3/4 confirmed, and they're going to be really exciting, but I can't tell you right now. So watch for more information through your email. Okay, and we hope to see you all at the conference. We want to thank our partner, the U.S. Forest Service, for the support on this series. We could absolutely not do this without them, and we're very thankful. And with that, I am going to give control over to Scott. And while he is, yep, here we go.
All right.
I want to thank everybody for answering that question too. Take it away, Scott.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. I appreciate you inviting me back here. Must have done okay on my first round to be invited back, so that's good. And you know, before I get started, I always like to do thank yous, and because I think it's important, and sometimes I end up rushing them if I'm at the end. So first and foremost, I do want to thank the Natural Areas Association for putting on this webinar series and for being so interested in all of these management topics that are so important for our wildlands. Thanks for the technology support to also get these off the ground. It's neat to be able to reach so many people so easily, just coming into my office at 9 in the morning and being able to talk to 400 plus people is awesome. So today I'm going to talk about best management practices for pollinators, and I want to really delve into how we in practice created these BMPs that we try to make implementable, because you know, we realize that land managers have a lot of questions out there, but a little time, and you need places where you can go and get implementable information. I do want to thank the many authors. This has been a heavy lift to get these best management practices just about completed. Emma Pelton, Stephanie McKnight, Candace Fallon, Rich Hatfield, May Code, Jennifer Hopwood, Sarah Hoyle, Serena Jepson are all on my staff and are all responsible for getting these documents done. That's not working. So I guess I'd better do that. Sorry, my technology is not working here. We can't advance the slides. So I'm getting a little technology support. Just give me 1 minute. And while we get this support, you know, oh, there we go. Now it's working. Just a few other thank yous. You know, Xerces could not do what we do without many partners, and we're really a partnership organization where we feel that together we can get a lot farther than working on our own. We have almost 14,000 members. We work with over 100 scientists around the world, dozens of federal agencies, actually many hundreds of farmers on habitat projects. Over 50 companies partner with us. Dozens of private foundations support us, and actually tens of thousands of citizen scientists help us take action for invertebrates. We now have 58 staff, and these are the people that do the heavy lifting of the Xerces Society. They're out working with folks every day to help implement conservation on the ground, and couldn't do that without them. And with all of your support and all of our supporters, you know, we've been able to attain habitat restoration on almost 700,000 acres. And on top of that, we've protected and restored over 1 million acres for some of the most rare and at-risk invertebrates, everything from freshwater mussels to bumblebees to tiger beetles to monarch butterflies. This work I'm talking about today is funded by the U.S. Forest Service, so you saw that earlier. They fund a lot of this good work, as well as the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We have to match all of these funds, and we do that through a whole variety of foundations, corporate sponsors, as well as Xerces members. So just some quick background on the BMPs before I get into the meat of the matter. You know, why develop rangeland BMPs? I think this is a given that we've got over 400 people attending this webinar, but you know, rangelands are essential to the conservation of pollinators. But land managers often don't have science-based actionable guidance, and that's really what we're trying to provide with these BMPs. And rangelands are very important for pollinators. Globally, semi-arid lands have the highest bee and butterfly diversity, and much of our rangelands fall into these categories. with incredibly diverse landscapes and incredibly diverse pollinator fauna. But unfortunately, many of these pollinators are in decline. Many pollinators in rangelands, actually, many pollinators across the globe are in decline. But in the West, we're seeing precipitous decline in a few of our iconic species, such as Western monarchs. A study which came out just a couple months ago, authored by Cheryl Schultz at Washington State University, along with others, including staff at the Xerces Society, found that Western monarchs have declined by more than 95% since the 1980s. There's a 72% chance of extinction over the next 20 years for monarchs. And so this is something we at Xerces take seriously, and we believe that land managers in rangelands across the West can be part of this solution. Bumblebees are also imperiled across the board. The Xerces Society worked with IUCN to assess bumblebees of the Americas, North, Central, and South America. And over a quarter of bumblebees fall into an imperiled category. 8 of these bumblebees are found in Western states, and many of them, like Bombus morrisoni, really are rangeland dependent. They are across the West using rangelands as their main habitat type. So this is just a pictorial representation of showing decline, and the average decline of Bombus morrisoni has been about 58%, which makes it vulnerable in the eyes of the IUCN. There are 17 butterflies that inhabit rangelands that are listed as federally endangered or threatened, and there are many, many more that are NatureServe ranked as imperiled. And last but certainly not least, we have vertebrates who are imperiled. Both hummingbirds and nectar-feeding bats have experienced declines across the West. These animals use rangelands as well. So just quickly, I think that lays out why we need actionable guidance on rangelands. Very quickly, just the process of bringing this to you. We started developing these rangeland BMPs and quickly found that we needed 2 sets. And because monarchs are proposed for listing or potential listing under the Endangered Species Act, and because they have very specific life histories, we felt that we needed to develop a best management practices just devoted to monarchs. But we also needed a more general best management practice that focused on our bumblebees, other butterflies across rangelands. So we're ending up with 2 documents that are very comprehensive. I'll talk a little bit more about that and when these come out, which is imminent in May and June. These are large documents with a review of over hundreds, actually several hundred studies and technical guidance to pull together the science on this. But then we surveyed over 50 land managers, practitioners, and researchers, because, you know, it's one thing to have the science, it's another to understand the land management implications. And we wanted to have both so that we could really do a deep dive into how land managers can move forward. And we ended up with really some fairly big buckets that are part of these BMPs: grazing, fire, pesticides, grasshopper management, managed pollinators, invasive species. All of these are dealt with in a systematic way in these BMPs. And there are some overarching principles that seem to come out when it came to pollinators and BMPs and all of the literature. And the first is heterogeneity. You know, diversity in vegetation structure and management practices really helps to maximize biodiversity, and as a surrogate really helps to maximize pollinator diversity. And then you've got interactions. You need to consider how natural forces such as drought and active management interact. And of course, you've heard this forever, but we need to be adaptive. You know, management for diverse animal populations requires an active feedback loop and the ability to adapt to changing conditions, because we're always learning more. We still have knowledge gaps and incomplete information, which we also lay out in these BMPs. And as we get more information, we can be adaptive to provide for these animals. Now, pollinators need really, I'd say, four major considerations when you're thinking about pollinator conservation. Most everybody, when they think of pollinators, thinks of nectar and pollen. They need food. Of course, they need diverse food sources from throughout the entire growing season. But they also need nesting or overwintering sites, protection from disease, as well as from competition from things like managed bees. Connectivity is a huge issue. We're seeing loss of connectivity across the landscape at the local and the landscape scale. And then pollinators, you know, you really do need to consider poisons such as pesticides, especially insecticides, when you're thinking about management. So if we look at these big buckets, I'm just going to do really a fairly brief overview of each of the big buckets we looked at, because each of these could be a webinar in itself. Xerces is really happy to provide these BMPs, which will be free when they come out, as well as any technical guidance as you move forward if you have questions once you get the BMPs. So grazing, of course, is an overarching issue on public lands, and the data is really clear that as grazing intensity increases, pollinator abundance and diversity decreases. This doesn't mean you don't ever graze. It means you need to be thoughtful if you are going to graze. And there are direct impacts, such as trampling and behavioral changes, as well as indirect effects, such as removal of floral resources, trampling of nest resources, as well as changes in hydrology. However, grazing, if done the right way, can be an important management tool for maintaining forb-dominated grasslands that benefit specific pollinator species. So it's not always a net negative if it's done thoughtfully. But it needs to really be done thoughtfully to protect pollinators. And in really looking at the data, anything over 40% of utilization is above what most pollinators can handle. And we really need to start thinking about moving livestock frequently. Rotational grazing, can be high density but short duration or low AUMs. We just need to think about not having these animals sit in one place over the season. We also need to limit some sensitive habitats, such as springs, montane meadows, areas where there's rare butterflies. And what really comes out in the literature is fall and winter grazing just has much fewer impacts than spring or summer grazing. And then one thing we also see is oftentimes we have a set amount of AUMs and we have the same amount of cows on landscape or sheep or whatever grazer, whether we've got drought conditions or really nice wet conditions. And we really need to think about that, because oftentimes we see the biggest impacts to pollinators during these drought cycles. Now, we're often asked as part of our grazing work, is grazing compatible with monarch habitat? And I think most people, when they think of monarch habitat, they think of milkweed. Monarchs require milkweed, but milkweed is toxic to livestock when consumed in large quantities. But looking at the data and sorting through it, we really think that this is compatible. But you do need to follow a few rules, and you need to ensure that there's enough forage and appropriate stocking rates. Most livestock poisoning happens because these animals are overstocked on the landscape and they have nothing left to eat but milkweed. Not always, but the majority. And we also need to keep milkweed as much as we can out of hay, because we shouldn't be baling milkweed up into hay fields. And there are a few milkweeds like Western World milkweed and narrowleaf milkweed that are more toxic and more readily eaten by cows that we should be thoughtful about, and we shouldn't be potentially restoring in areas of grazing with those milkweeds. Of course, fire is another major issue, it really, we need to be thinking and using fire as a tool, because we're really seeing huge changes in these landscapes. This photo shows a study site that I work on with Martin Skipper, and you'll see the site in the 50s and the site in 2011. It used to be this large meadow complex, and now it's these enclosed meadow complex. So fire is an important tool in many of these landscapes, but burning really has a variable response to pollinators. Burning negatively impacts butterflies and above ground nesting bees more than ground nesting bees. And burning in areas with populations of butterflies and certain other pollinators could really extirpate them if not done carefully. So we really think that some thoughtful controlled burning is in order when we're thinking about pollinators. Thinking of leaving a third of the, leave at least a third of the area unburned, basically so pollinators can recolonize, thinking about burning in the winter months, and always thinking about when you burn, if you're reseeding, think about the forbs that these pollinators will use. Grasshopper management is an issue that I've dealt with for now almost 2 decades. And there are several species of grasshoppers and Mormon crickets that periodically explode, or we have large populations on rangelands. And in outbreak years, large amounts of insecticides have been used to manage these insects. And all of the insecticides used for grasshopper management actually can have quite a negative impact on pollinators. But grasshopper and Mormon cricket management or outbreaks really could potentially be managed through thoughtful grazing, thoughtful vegetation management through fire. We do need more study on this, and one of the things we point out in the BMPs is it would be good to get more researchers, more graduate students thinking about this, so that down the road we have better management guidelines for grasshoppers. One thing we really do know is we need increased monitoring, because Canada has a much better monitoring program than we do on most of our public lands in the United States. And it really shows in the amount of pesticides that they end up using for management of these grasshoppers, because they're monitoring and managing on a small scale. Now, I know there's lots of interest in this issue of honeybees on public lands, and Jim's talk is going to do a deep dive into floral competition, which is certainly an issue between honeybees and native bees, wherever large numbers of honeybee hives are kept, and public lands. If we move large numbers of honeybee hives onto these areas, are going to potentially see those impacts of competition. The other issue is spread of disease. There are studies that show that honeybee diseases can be spread to bumblebees, which is also, of course, a major concern with placing honeybee hives on public lands. Now, we've got a document coming out that's part of the BMPs, but also a standalone document on honeybees with the literature all reviewed and cited. But here's just some things to consider if you are thinking about putting honeybees on public lands. You know, are there populations of endangered or threatened pollinators present on the land? You know, and I would go beyond that. Sensitive species, species that are potentially at risk. We need to be really thoughtful about that. And we can help you. We've got bumblebee records for national forests all over the West, or actually areas all over the West. If you're thinking about putting honeybee hives, we can get you those records. Think about invasive plant populations, because sometimes there is some limited data that honeybees preferentially pollinate some of our invasive plants. What are the impacts of other wildlife? There have been issues where bears will get habituated to honeybee hives. And is there sufficient infrastructure, you know, to pull in a large semi and put a lot of hives on these areas? And if you decide that after you've looked at all of this that honeybee hives might be appropriate, we feel there are a few things to think about as well. That any apiary, no matter the number of hives, needs to be more than 4 miles from known populations of these rare or sensitive pollinators, as well as plants that need pollinators, native pollinators to pollinate them. We also believe that, you know, sensitive areas like wilderness areas, study areas, you know, national monuments, we should have honeybee hives at least 4 miles from those, as well as from special habitats such as high elevation meadows and wet meadows, where they might more preferentially impact native bees. And we also believe that each apiary should have no more than 10 or 20 hives, and they should be separated by at least 4 miles as well. So I know there's lots of interest on this. We can follow up with our literature review on this and our specific BMPs. These will be included in the larger BMPs as well. You know, restoration is a really important component. I'm running a little over, so I'm going to take a couple extra minutes because I went a little deeper into honeybees. And we need to be thoughtful in our restoration to make sure that we're including pollinators when we think about our restoration efforts and including plants for pollinators. And we've got really great opportunities because sage grouse sage grouse habitat and pollinator habitat is really almost the same thing. And so we should be thoughtful and see where we can integrate these approaches. We also need to be thoughtful about invasive species management. Of course, this is just, some of this is common sense. We need to try to prevent invasion of these species. But if we need to control invasive species, we need to be thoughtful about minimizing non-target, plants, not hitting plants that are just periphery to this. And we need to be thoughtful about ensuring revegetation plans, because sometimes pollinators are using these non-native species as now their nectar source, and when we get rid of them, if we don't revegetate after, we could actually have a negative impact. I'm not going to go into this in huge detail, but again, we've got BMPs that are coming out specifically to monarchs. We've worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, University of Nevada, Reno, as well as other partners, basically to do habitat suitability modeling to try to identify key areas that we should focus on for monarch conservation across the West. And this is discussed more in more detail in the BMPs. And we've also come up with management windows for monarchs. When is the best time if you have to mow an area that might have milkweed, if you need to do prescribed burning to an area where monarchs use? when is the best time to minimize the impact to monarch butterflies. So we've been able to detail that in these management windows in our BMPs. And really last, I will say that there are still research gaps. We are providing you with the best available information. And our BMPs have all the backing documentation so that you can see why we came up with the recommendations we did. But we're always honest when we say we have limited information, and that's why adaptive management is going to be needed and why we need more research out there. And finally, I just want to point out that you can help the Xerces Society and our partners at federal and state agencies gather some of this data through the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. This was the information, thousands of records that we used to do habitat suitability modeling. We're continuing to build on this model to try to get records in areas that we have fewer records. So you can participate in this if you're out west and be part of this effort. We've also just kicked off our Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. It's a collaborative effort with a whole variety of partners, state partners and universities that will gather information in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho on bumblebees so that we can make informed conservation decisions. And basically, you adopt a grid cell, you go out and survey bumblebees, and you input that information into Bumblebee Watch, which is a cooperative effort that we have, citizen science platform. And we'll be able to then get more information so that we can continue to provide adaptive management on all of these issues. Finally, the BMPs for monarchs will be out in May 2018. For pollinators, will be out in June 2018. And we will send these to the Natural Areas Association. Just in the last 30 seconds, we already have a ton of resources, so please go to the Xerces Society website, whole variety of resources. I know somebody mentioned they want resources for more urban areas. We have some resources, and we are developing new guidelines specifically for urban areas that will come out this summer, pollinators in urban areas. We've got restoration guidelines with site-specific or very locally specific plant lists, specific guidelines that we did with federal highways and the Forest Service on roadside revegetation and roadside best management practices, and a lot of others. So I went a little over because I wanted to go a little deeper into the honeybee effort, but thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. We will get these BMPs out to folks, and then we're really happy to follow up with folks once you get these if you have questions, because we love the idea of working with you to make rangelands and making the entire West a better place for pollinators. Thank you.
Scott, I think that if you want to take some questions, I think a lot of people answered the question I asked, but I think the first question that is directly to you is from Ellery Troyer. Do you want me to read it? Or
Sure. Okay. Sure, that would be helpful, actually. Thank you.
Sure. And Ellery, thanks for the question. Ellery's a frequent flyer. I recognize your name. Can you explain the 40% max utilization rate regarding grazing? Is there a standard head/acre that we are talking about?
I can, what I'd want to do is go back to the data we have, and I always want to say when I'm a little out of my depth. If you follow up with an email to scott.black@xerces.org, I can answer that, and then we can get it to the entire group. It's a great question, but I think it'd be a lot for me to go in, and I want to take a deep breath and be thoughtful about it. So it's one of the things that I always say, if I don't readily know the answer, I don't want to speak out of turn, but we can follow up on that.
Okay. Gina says, she asks, you said that managed honeybees can spread diseases to native, I think she means bees, spread diseases to native bees. What diseases in particular? Does this include the varroa mite?
Not really. The varroa mite is really a specialist to honeybees, but there are other pathogens, viral and fungal, that can potentially be spread to especially bumblebees. Bumblebees are fairly closely related to honeybees, but as far as I know, the varroa mite isn't one of them. I think varroa mites need a really large hive, and the one difference between honeybees and our bumblebees is, honeybees have many thousands of individuals in a hive, whereas bumblebees have hundreds of individuals in a hive. And there's still research that's needed. We know that some of these diseases can be transferred, but we don't know how readily. We don't know how serious the implications are. That said, one of the big issues with bumblebees and bumblebee decline are diseases spread from commercial bumblebees. Many people don't know that actually we use commercial bumblebees in greenhouses for tomato pollination, but also in some cases in open field pollination. And they are allowed in most states for open field pollination, not in Oregon and not in California, but most other states. And we do have good data to show that bumblebees, commercial bumblebees, do spread diseases to their native bumblebee cousins. And that heightens the concern, because these diseases are thought to be one of the proximate causes for decline and potential extinction of a species called Bombus franklini, Franklin's bumblebee. So, once you get a disease in a population, you can see major impacts from that. And we think we should be cautious with honeybees around some of our sensitive bee populations, not just from a competition point of view, but because of the potential of disease.
Okay, great. I wanted to remind people that we're submitting questions through the chat function. And Tyler asks, there are many ecosystems in the Rockies where flies are the primary pollinators of alpine ecosystems. Any discussion of fly habitat and the best management practices?
I love what a great question. Yes, what many people don't know is, as you get into high elevations, or as you get into higher latitudes up in tundra, flies become disproportionately important for pollination, because bees are not able to effectively live out their more complex life cycle. And flies, many of the same issues apply. Flies need these nectar resources, mostly nectar, to fuel their flight and to fuel their reproduction. And grazing, especially at high elevations, I will be honest, there aren't a ton of studies. There are very few studies on this. But we really believe that removal of these floral resources could probably have an impact on some of these fly species as well. Some of these flies are also really important biocontrol agents. Their larvae eat pest species such as aphids. Others, of course, lay their eggs on carrion. So there are some unique life histories for the flies, but I do think many of the issues apply for flies. Grazing, especially insecticide use. So ensuring that we have robust floral resources for these fly pollinators is likely as important as for bees at lower elevations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. Wendy has a question. She asks, how were the monarch management areas identified, and will the eastern, western states like Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and eastern Wyoming be covered at some time in the future?
Yeah, and I think I know what Wendy this is. Yes, so we pulled these together based on, where monarchs are found in the landscape, where milkweed's found in the landscape, where monarchs are, showing up across the season, similar to what, if this is Wendy from Monarch Joint Venture, similar to the very elegant work that Monarch Joint Venture did in the East to come up with those zones, management zones in the East. As you might see, because we have so much elevation gain, we were not able to put into nice bands because, we've got going over the Sierra Nevada, going over the Cascades, we've got the Great Basin. So these are based on when monarchs are arriving and when monarchs are leaving. And Wendy did see on our map that we have this gap, which is eastern Montana, eastern Colorado, basically east of the Continental Divide. Wendy, we didn't have enough data from our milkweed mapper or what we thought from other sources to really come up with comprehensive guidance. And we're now getting more data. We're doing some short courses in Colorado. We're trying to get the information we need, and we'd love to work with you, if this is Wendy at MJV, or Wendy, whoever you are, to connect these two maps up in the landscape. But we didn't want to step out of our comfort zone and start to put information on a map where we really didn't have the data to back it up.
Okay. Rebecca has a two-part question. She asks, does the monarch habitat suitability modeling include Colorado, or will the modeling methodology be available so that we can duplicate it ourselves?
Yes, and it's a great point. We are, and this kind of goes into the last question. We're right now trying to crowdsource information so we can close the gap between the East and the West. Early on, most of the data for Western monarchs was California, Oregon, Washington, Eastern Washington, Idaho, and really the western part of the Great Basin. We've been trying to crowdsource more information so that we can start to include Colorado, in all of Colorado, more of Montana, all the way over into New Mexico, into this model, as well as into our discussion of when to manage. So that is in the works, and we'd be happy to work with folks like yourself if you want to reach out to me again at scott.black@xerces.org to discuss how you might be able to help us get the information we need so that we can take that next step. Again, we're cautious. We we have to be adaptive. We have to sometimes step out of our comfort zone a little, based on the information we have. But when we hit a place where we really don't have the information to make an informed decision, we want to be honest about that as well. But that's what we're trying to do now, is crowdsource the information so that we can, again, close the gap, quote unquote, between the Eastern and Western monarchs, because there is really no gap. They flow, we know that populations flow back and forth between the East and the West. And we would love to end up with a more comprehensive map of this middle area. And it is becoming a priority for us now.
Wonderful. Thanks, Scott. I'm going to respond to Lori, and then I think we're just, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, and I think we probably should move on to Jim's presentation. Lori asks, will you please send out the best management practices to all the attendees? And Lori, I think I can assure you that if you are on the NAA email list, or probably, very probably, the Xerces Society email list, that you're going to know when those are out and that you'll be able to go to the website and download them. I know they're quite long, so I would think it would probably be best for you to access them online rather than having them emailed. I'm not sure they could go by email. So, but if you're on either our or the Xerces Society mailing list, I'm pretty sure you're going to hear about those when they debut. Correct, Scott?
Yes, they will go out on a whole variety of networks, as I said, in May and in June. And they'll be easily downloaded as a PDF from our website. So we will be sending out emails to folks with a link so that you can just link to it and download them. And I do want to say they are long because we wanted really the backing documentation to why we came up with our specific recommendations, but we've laid them out so that they're really quite easy for a land manager to go right to the recommendations versus the more detailed background. We understand you are all busy and nobody maybe has time to sit down and read a 100-page document all at once, and you'll want a reference. And we've set these up so that you can have that easy reference to the management sections of the document.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, so far for all the questions. I'm going to queue up Jim Kane's presentation. For those of you who joined us late, Jim is in Berlin at the 11th Annual Pollinators Symposium, and it's international symposium. It's a big deal. But he did record his presentation for us. I'm going to put it up in just a second. You should be able to hear him speak. It isn't just the slides. And I do ask that if you have, many of you are going to have questions of Jim, and he very graciously has offered to answer questions via email. So just 1 second here. We'll share my screen. Hopefully this will work beautifully and without a hitch. Okay.
Good morning and welcome to this webinar. I appreciate Lisa's invitation to speak to you on this topic. My name is Jim Kane. I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture at the Pollinating Insect Research Unit on the campus of Utah State University in Logan, Utah.
Oops, sorry, hold on 1 second, guys. I think that I hit something. Let me do it again.
This week, however, while you're listening here, I'm at the International Pollination Symposium in Berlin, Germany. As a consequence, this is recorded. I've worked with wild bees and pollination for 40 years, both in wildland as well as agricultural settings around the country. I'll begin today by giving you background about pollen and nectar use by solitary bees, their dietary needs of their larvae, so you can appreciate my calculations for quantifying the potential for competition between honeybees and native bees for finite floral resources. This actually has relevance to an agricultural context, but today we'll be talking about wildlands. The U.S. is home to about 4,000 named species of native bees, and this is likely a very nearly complete compilation of what we have. In any given location, you can expect to encounter anywhere between a 20th and a 10th of that diversity. Especially in areas that have intact native floras and some diverse habitats, perhaps along topographic gradients. Here's 3 examples defined by political boundaries for rather thoroughly collected faunas and work performed by our lab over the past 40 or 50 years. In terms of floral hosts, sunflowers probably host the most native bee species, around 200 at least and counting. Creosote bush in the southwestern deserts hosts 120 species of bees, all by itself, including a number of floral specialists. Clearly, there are more species of native bees in most habitats than there are native birds, native mammals, or native reptiles. And this is important because all those bees, many of those bees, are involved in pollination of one or more floral hosts. Not all of them. A fair number of these bees are also kleptoparasites in the same way that cowbirds lay their eggs in the nests of other bird species. We'll disregard those for now and continue on to the topic. There are quite a few social species in North America. The ones that you're familiar with, I'm sure, are bumblebees, like pictured on the left, all good-sized bees, hairy, especially important in more northerly and higher altitude habitats because of their ability to shiver and keep warm and forage at cool temperatures. There's also social sweat bees, genus Halictus, genus Lasioglossum, who are active all season long. And these bees are primitively social. Right now, where you are and where I am, it's all the overwintering queens who are trying to start nests. Their nests, however, will eventually yield workers if they're successful and persist through the season, but then it's only mated queens who make it through the winter to try to start nests the next year. Although they're ubiquitous, these social bees taxonomically are not only are a small fraction of our overall fauna. Taxonomic minority. And the honeybee is not a native to anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and in our western mountains and hills, once you get out of the warm deserts, they are not resident either. There aren't feral populations in the background like in the eastern United States, but rather if you see honeybees in a national forest in the west, generally that means that is coming from a managed hive, like pictured here, actually a quad of hives. Instead, most of our bees are not social. Each female is fertile, each is mated, each digs her own nest or excavates a nest or rents a cavity in dead wood like you see on the right. Because they only have one generation a year, they can afford to be taxonomic specialists. The species can. Taxonomic specialists on a particular genus or family of flowering plant. Most of our native bees, and indeed most native bees, we think, most all around the world, are ground nesters. Certainly amongst the solitary species this is true. At my estimate for eastern North America is in this ballpark, say 3/4 of the species are ground nesters. The remainder are either ones that rent cavities in wood from wood-boring beetles after they've emerged, or occasionally in the case of large carpenter bees they dig their own tunnels in wood, or species that nest in hollow twigs, or pithy twigs where they excavate the pith. But most are ground nesters, which means that they're not easily manipulated, or monitored even, for population studies. There's some traits about solitary bees that you need to understand in order to appreciate their existence on the landscape. You already understand that the majority are ground nesters and solitary, not social. Their lifespan as an active adult is fairly brief. A few weeks of hard, busy bee work, and then that female dies. This is in quite a contrast to many of the perennial plants that they pollinate who flower year after year. Given that individuals emerge not in perfect synchrony, you might expect to see a given species of bee, like pictured here, Xerces fulvitarsis. You might expect to see that species active in a locale for about a month. What that means is that month on month, so say from June to July, there's almost a complete turnover in the fauna of active bees that you'll see at flowers, the exception being the social bees that are persistent. There's also no bee bank. I'm thinking this as an analogy with seed banks. In seed banks, say with annuals, and you see no annuals flowering in a given dry spring, doesn't mean the species is absent. It just means that they're in a resting stage in the soil. This is not true for bees, with the possible exception of some desert species. For a given year, the entire species is exposed with no backup. It's impressive that they make it, but they do. They're also slow to reproduce. Their reproductive rate is more akin to that of turkeys or pheasants than it is to, say, gypsy moth or most other insects that can lay several hundred eggs in a brief lifespan. And if that population of bees, say over the course of its 1 month of activity, if the weather is foul that entire time, or something kills them all at that time, then that species goes locally extinct. Now there's further constraints with solitary bees. With social bees, especially with honeybees, they can collect all nectar 1 week to make honey, collect all pollen the next week, they store it in their colony, and then they can mix that in the proper ratios to feed their progeny. For solitary bees, each day she provisions 1 or 2 nest cells. It's a mass provision. There's not progressive feeding here. And she has to collect pollen and nectar in the right ratio for her species. For instance, if the female of the Nomia on the right, who fed that little tiny larva a provision that was liquid, like that of Collides on the left, that larva would drown. Conversely, if a Collides larva receives a pasty provision like the one on the right, it would die of desiccation. So they have to have nectar and pollen available daily in the right ratio for their species. Moreover, for individual foraging trips, females, at least efficiently, come back with both pollen and nectar loads, so a crop full of nectar and a scopa, the pollen-carrying brush, on their hind legs or under their abdomen full of pollen. And as you can see from this very clever experiment, it's worth looking up, it's a neat study, using gravimetric methods, you can see that the female progressively carries a larger and larger proportion of nectar in her loads until the last couple loads are just nectar, and then she mixes it all up to make just the right proportion of pollen and nectar to yield the right constitution for the provision mass. And this has only been documented for the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, Megachile rotundata, which is managed for alfalfa pollination. But it's a very fortuitous choice, as you'll see from my calculations for competition with honeybees. Now what happens if the mother bee can't get things in those right proportions? What if there's a competitor for nectar, or there's not much pollen being produced on their preferred floral host or within flight range of her nest? Or the weather's lousy. Perhaps she only gets a 2-hour time window between shower events. Well, if she can't complete a provision in a day, typically they abandon that provision, especially ground nesting bees, probably because an open cell, a nest cell underground with nectar and pollen just sitting there is going to be very prone to spoilage and waste a very valuable egg that she would lay. If that provision's too dry because there wasn't adequate nectar, the larva will die of desiccation. If there just isn't enough to go around, perhaps there's not much bloom that year, a dry spring. Small provisions, the female bee does have the ability to choose which sex each egg is, and she can bias it towards smaller individuals of the smaller sex. So if they're short on food, they'll make more males, typically. And that's a good thing, because if she couldn't control the sex and some of those were small daughters instead, they can't forage as far, and really small daughters actually starve during winter dormancy because they can't store enough fat body to make it through the winter to support their metabolism. Lastly, if bloom is depleted or depleted prematurely, that results in longer foraging trips, of course. And those longer foraging trips give more opportunity for parasitic wasps and parasitic bees to parasitize that unguarded nest. Because they're solitary, it's just the mother bee and that's it as far as defense. There aren't workers who can help defend like social bees. So with all that said, one would like to think one could have good direct experiments to evaluate exploitative competition between native bees and honeybees in terms of reproductive consequences, like what I was just describing. But in fact, these are very difficult, if not impossible, to pull off in a realistic field setting. As I posed here as an analogy, imagine you wanted to look at grazing studies and the impact of forage removal by cattle on reproduction, say, in pronghorn antelope. Well, the challenge with bees is, of course, they can fly over any containment. Cows can't fly, but if you didn't have fences, imagine how hard it would be to set up a replicated experiment given how far cows and pronghorns can move. It's the same problem with bees, if not worse, because you can't even see them when they go out to forage. One of the best examples is this study by Diane Thompson. Not a realistic number of hives, it's just 1 or 2 hives matched up with a bumblebee colony, but it's beautifully done with a very insightful evaluations of worker production, colony growth, production of reproductive individuals at the end of the year, and there's impacts on all of them, even at that small scale. So I've been looking for, or was encouraged to look for another way of studying this, as motivated by a symposium I was asked to speak at, hosted by the USDA in Washington, D.C. about honeybee nutrition, and they wanted me to talk specifically about competition. At this moment, there's probably more reviews of honeybee competition with native bees than there is actual data. And so I came up with a different approach to it, and working with my colleague Vince Tepedino, we fleshed this out into a paper that was published in Conservation Letters not so long ago. We took a different approach, took the idea of dietary equivalence. So the honeybee, as you can see foraging here on a blackberry flower, is collecting pollen that she moistens with nectar to make that pellet on the hind leg. The alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, who I introduced earlier as being particularly well studied for reproductive dynamics, happens to be the average size wild bee from 1 or 2 thorough community studies, including one by Steve Bullock. So we can use that alfalfa leaf-cutting bee as a representative bee of what's on the landscape. And my objective is to be able to, by one way or another, to equate those pollen pellets that honeybees are bringing back, pollen nectar pellets really, which you can collect in large numbers in pollen traps like you see on the bottom hive on the left, and equate that to what's in the provision mass that makes one alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. And the trick here is that all these solitary bees make a mass provision. It's not progressive provisioning. So that goop you see right there with the egg on it, that's going to feed the larva that emerges from that egg. That's all it needs, and it's not going to get anything added to it. So it's very convenient that way. For the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, it happens to be that I've done studies, and it's one of the few species where this is known, proportional representation of sugars and water from nectar and pollen in the provision mass. And from my work and the work of others, we have an idea also of how many, in this case alfalfa flowers, it takes to make one of those provisions. So here's the calculations, and this is present in the paper that Vince and I published. So you can find it there if you want to read through it more, but this lays it out in a nice graphical representation. Essentially, the pollen pellet on the hind leg of the bee is reasonably comparable to the sugar content of the provision mass of an alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. It's actually much closer to that of a lot of other solitary bees who make a more pasty provision than the somewhat liquid provision of the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. If we work with fresh weights, those pellets weigh about 15 milligrams each, and if you take 6 of them, adds up to 90 milligrams. And the provision weight of one alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, to make one alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, that provision weight, fresh weight, is 90 milligrams. So 3 loads of pollen coming back with a honeybee equals 1 solitary bee of average size. From Tom Seeley's excellent book, Honeybee Ecology, who worked with wildland full-sized honeybee colonies and measured the influx of pollen pellets as well as the influx of nectar on a daily basis throughout a season, this adds up to the fact that each hive's foragers, over the course of 3 months, say June, July, and August, collect enough pollen and admixed with nectar to feed 100,000 native bees of the size of the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. Obviously, it would feed a lot fewer bumblebees. It would feed a lot more of tiny sweat bees. I've calculated this in an entirely independent way. Again, using some of the information in Seeley's book, he also reported on the total number of workers produced by a colony, in his case over 5 months in the Northeast in a wildland setting. If I adjust that for 3 months again, so 90,000 workers are produced. Honeybees are bigger than alfalfa leaf-cutting bees, so we adjust for the difference in fresh weight of or dry weights of body sizes, and calculate through with that. We come up with an estimate that's very close to the estimate I just gave you. Neighborhood of 100,000 native bees of average size. So I have pretty good confidence that this is a reasonable estimate of the exchange that happens. Now, past modeling attempts to try to figure this out have, as you can see here, been around for a long time. And they involve mammals and birds and hands-on studies and interactions and everything else. But in truth, we don't know so much. So what I've done over the past couple summers on the side while doing my other research is we've looked at distances from apiaries that have been placed, in this case on Forest Service or BLM lands. We've looked at distances from those apiaries of a known count of colonies, and looked at the ratio of honeybees to native bees at wildflower species that are preferred by those native bees, to get an idea of the spatial extent over which they might be numerically dominant. So from that apiary, about 3 to 4 miles away, this is one of the places where we then counted native bees on walking transects. And here you can see there's the blue is Polemonium, the white is Achillea, and most of the yellow is Senecio. This is near Strawberry Reservoir. All we did, and this is something you can do yourself, and in fact additional data really would be welcome. If you can recognize a honeybee on a flower, you can recognize other insects on flowers that are bees, in this case a bumblebee at Phacelia, but you have to learn to recognize some other bees and distinguish them from flies or wasps. It's not very hard. Then you simply walk along, looking in an unbiased manner at plants and counting honeybees and counting other bees on a walk until you've counted several hundred bees, and there you have it, the ratio of honeybees to native bees. This is all that we've done. Plus we've sampled some to identify bees. So from that one apiary I just showed the picture of that had 90 hives, at distances out to just about 4 miles, we were finding at the Polemonium, that blue-flowered wildflower, that honeybees were vastly outnumbering all the native bees at that flower. If you use that as a radius to calculate an 8-mile diameter around that apiary, you're talking about 60 square miles of numerical dominance of honeybees over native bees at preferred wildflowers. That's an impressive number. This is our data to date from several different locations, although around 96 hive apiaries. I have some other size apiaries as well. And in the clear bars for a given location at a given distance, the clear bars show the number of honeybees, the black bars show the proportional numbers of native bees. In pink are Phacelia, blue is Polemonium, and one it's Senecio, which is supposed to be toxic for bees, or so we're told. What you can see is that at varying distances, honeybees are numerically dominant. Now you have to bear in mind something here, which is that as the day progresses and honeybees deplete floral resources nearer their hive, they'll move out to greater and greater distances because they have to. It's less efficient, they spend more time doing that, more wear on the foragers, more energy lost in flight, but it's better than not getting any resource at all. And what this means is that if you sample near the hives in a big apiary late in the day, you may not see many honeybees and be led to the mistaken conclusion that they're really not dominating at all. So you have to be aware of this a little bit, and get a little bit familiar with it before you do such surveys. I'll give you a second example. These are surveys. This is actually what started my concern. This is in Tony Grove in our mountains. Spectacular wildflower meadows up in this alpine area, mostly a wilderness area, very heavily visited by people as well. And here I was looking at Phacelia hastata, a great bee plant, and this little bumblebee again working. As you can see, there's a great diversity of bee genera and species that work this plant, and in good abundance, because these aren't very big plants, but bees are numerous at it, of wild bees. So this is half size of that previous apiary, 40 hives, out at distances of 2.5 miles as the crow flies, much longer as the trail goes. And again, like that previous example I gave you, honeybees are numerically dominating native bees, and they're only coming from that apiary. I have checked, I convinced myself, looked before the hives are put there, and there are no honeybees anywhere in the locale, not even at the apiary site. So these really are bees coming only from the managed hives. Mind you, at that location, this is what those bees are flying over in order to get to the Phacelia. These are great bee plants, especially the pink ones in the foreground. But they've already used those up, and they're flying further to get to the Phacelia at a distance of more than 2 miles. The last example is a different one again. This is on BLM land. This is in the Snake River Basin, or plains. And this is at a plant that honeybees, I never see honeybees visiting it in wildland settings in general, partly because they don't like it. It's a member of the carrot family, has a number of specialist bees in the genus Andrena, like the one pictured there. Biscuit roots, common name. But when there's an apiary nearby and there's not other forage to be had, honeybees at 4 different patches of this, at a mile distant, were outnumbering these native Andrena or completely dominating them. And this can't be good, because this is the only floral host for those Andrena. They can't turn to another plant like those balsam roots there in the background with the orange flowers. So I hadn't thought of it until I pursued this topic some, but really the crux of the argument would be that if honeybees don't have an impact, if there's not competition going on, and that means that there must be surplus pollen that remains, and nectar that remains at the end of the day that goes unspoken for in the absence of honeybees. So in other words, native bees just aren't drawing down the standing crop of pollen and nectar completely. And it's not something that people would go about studying, and wouldn't be very showy as research, and it's a lot of work to monitor standing crops of pollen and nectar with enough replication to be representative. But a handful of studies I've found have done this not as the main intent of their study, but they happen to have monitored it. And what you can see is that native bees draw down the standing crop of pollen quite dramatically, sometimes in the course of a morning, certainly by the end of the day. And there's more examples in that Canaan Tepidino study that I showed you. This is just some, including some that I didn't include there because I found them more recently. So the argument that there's a lot of surplus pollen going unused does not seem to be certainly not a universal truth. I'm sure there's opportunities where that happens, but it may not be the standard outcome. And why does all this matter? Well, the topic here is about western mountains and honeybee apiaries. And in our collections at the Pollinating Insect Research Unit is the largest database collection of bees in the world. So far we have 1/3 of a million species that are in the database out of probably 1 million in our holdings. And we search that database just for those caught on national forests in the West. It's about 1/3 or a little bit more than all the species found in North America. And our western forests, I know for a fact, and talking to the curator, he agrees, are under-collected relative to, say, the warm deserts, like the Sonoran Desert and Chihuahuan Desert, which have been much more thoroughly sampled. So this may be an underestimate. And so I would argue that our western national forests are a major repository for the bulk of North America's native bee fauna. And that said, I think we have to proceed just like we do with grazing, or intend to do, proceed with some moderation. Now, this is a recorded webinar because I'm in Berlin right now at the International Pollination Symposium giving a presentation. However, you will be able to send any email questions to me, and perhaps we can share them around somewhat, or perhaps we can have a conference call later, something to where we can talk this around, because there's things that I still don't understand, and there may be some fresh perspectives that one or more of you have that might help with thinking on this topic in general. But I thank you for your patience. I look forward to some good thinking from some of you that may have insights or questions or assumptions I've overlooked that might polish this thinking and get us on the right track. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your patience.
All right, everybody, can you hear me? Could somebody type it and just make sure that I can be heard? Yay, okay. Slightly different tech than I'm used to. Thank you so much, everybody. That was Jim's presentation. I don't know about you guys, but I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I would like to put something together where maybe we can reconvene in some sort of way. We do have a pollinator listserv that's just getting started. I'm going to think on this and talk to Jim when he gets back to Berlin. And it might be just a forum where we get back to you about your questions. Please do, if you, oh, Victoria's mentioning, I think it would be great if Jim can respond to all the questions in one document and that document be shared by email to those who register for this talk. That's one really good suggestion, Victoria, and that may be the one that I take. I can be in touch with all of you guys. I will obviously have your emails, and Jim will as well. So, but if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat right now, or if you prefer, you can send them directly to Jim, or quite frankly, you can send them to me if you like. It's kangel@naturalareas.org. All of you, I think, have my email. We really want more conversation with this, and I'm just going to take this opportunity to say this has been an incredible experience for me. I've never seen anybody, any group of people so engaged and so hungry for more information about a topic as I've seen for the Pollinator webinar series. So it's pretty amazing. Tara, hi. I don't know the answer to that, but I will make sure that Scott gets that question. Yes, Wendy, thank you. Thanks to all of you guys. I'm going to be posting this video within the next 24 hours. You obviously will get that. And then we'll just keep in touch. I'm gonna talk to Jim and see what we can do about getting people back together, or possibly just distributing questions and answers. Thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful. Have a great field season, and remember, we're always here. And we'll be having another webinar in May. So thank you, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for all the work you do.